Tensions rising, I hear voices in my head. They counsel me, they understand. They talk to me. They talk to me. They tell me things that I will do. They show me things I'll do to you. They talk to me. Talk to me, talk to me, talk to me. They talk to me. Talk to me, talk to me.
What's up, YouTubers? This is Harpy Hunter 89 coming at you from the Duelist Den, and the voices in my head are telling me that some cards in this game make people just way too salty. Now, the only criteria for this list is that in the card's prime, it had to make players so salty that as soon as it was played, they just scooped the game. Now, the second criteria I was going to use was that at one point in its life it had to be on the banned or limited list. Unfortunately, there are some cards on this list that didn't make that cut, but they did deserve to be on this list. So with that being said, here's the top 10 saltiest cards of all time. Taking the number 10 spot is Shooting Quasar Dragon. This big behemoth is the ultimate form of Stardust Dragon. And what made this card so powerful is that at minimum, it could attack twice. And considering that it has 4,000 attack and defense, that's pretty impressive because it usually meant a one-turn kill. The effects of this card also state that once per turn, during either player's turn, when a card or effect is activated, you negate the activation, and if you do, destroy it. That is pretty powerful just in its own right, but then it goes even further and states that if your opponent can somehow get this card off the field, you can special summon a Shooting Star Dragon from your extra deck. Now that means that even if they bounce it back to the extra deck, you're getting your Shooting Star Dragon, which again is another card that can attack multiple times. And given its impressive stats, even if your opponent had Skill Drain, it was pretty hard to get around this card. Number 9 goes to legendary 6 Samurai Shien. This card is so low on the list, mainly because you can really only run it if you're running Warriors and 6 Samurais. So that's why it's so low on the list. But what this card does is, whenever your opponent activated a spell or trap card effect, you can negate its activation and destroy it. And if this face-up card on the field will be destroyed, you can destroy another 6 Samurai monster you control instead. Now, given the fact that once per turn you can negate a spell or trap card is what defined this card. Add into that it has its own safety feature by destroying other 6 Samurais instead of itself. If you couldn't negate an effect because you wasted that on something, then your opponent dropped a Regeki or something, this card was still essentially safe. And given the 6 Samurais can bring 4 or 5 monsters out pretty much every turn, meant that this card was usually safe. Number 9 on the list goes to Light and Darkness Dragon. This card was extremely powerful. Not only did it have good stats with 2800 attack, 2400 defense, but its effect was just ridiculous. Once per chain, you can negate the activation of a spell, trap, or monster effect at the cost of 500 attack and defense points. And if this card was ever destroyed, you could destroy all of the cards you control and then special summon a monster from the graveyard. Now, the only downside to this card is that it could not be special summoned, which kind of sucks, but considering it was around during Frog Monarch and getting the tributes off for it was real easy, that wasn't really a big deal back in this card's prime. But that's mainly why it made so low on this list. Number 7 on the list goes to number 16, Shockmaster. This card was in its prime, right there near the beginning of the Spellbook and Dragon Ruler formats. And what made this card so powerful wasn't its stats, it was the effect. Now, the effect states that once per turn, you detach one material from this card to declare one card type, monster, spell, or trap. And the declared card type, if spell or trap, cannot be activated, or if monster, it cannot activate its effects until the end of your opponent's turn. Now, what made this card so powerful with that effect is that it pretty much shut your opponent's deck down from doing what it does best. For example, with Spellbooks. If you had this card on the field, you knew your opponent was playing Spellbooks, you detach a material, declare spells, and the Spellbook deck was pretty much shut down. And it wasn't just for that deck. Pretty much any deck has one thing it does. And if you can shut that one thing down, then the deck is pretty much dead. The number 6 spot goes to Mast Hero Darklaw. Now this card has seen a lot of play, especially in recent days, and it's just super powerful because it pretty much stops your opponent's decks from doing what they do best. Now this card's effect states that any card sent to your opponent's graveyard is banished instead, and once per turn if your opponent adds cards from their deck to their hand except during the draw phase or damage step, you can banish one card from your opponent's hand. Now given the fact that pretty much every deck these days relies on the ability to use their graveyard, that is really dangerous. Add into the fact that every deck these days has at least 2 to 3 search engines for the deck, and even the rogue decks use draw cards like Upstart and Polyduality. This card is just really dangerous against pretty much everything it faces off against. Add into the fact that with 2,400 attack points, it has pretty decent stats. This card is just a force to be reckoned with. Dominating the number 5 spot on this list is Apocalypse Cleafort Towers. Now, this is a level 10 monster that really dominated every game that it played in. Now, this card states that it cannot be special summoned, and it requires 3 Clee tributes to normal summon or set. Now, considering Cleaforts have that fucking spell card that counts as 2 tributes, I mean, getting the summoning requirements off was pretty easily. The next part of the effect states that if it is normal summoned or set, it is unaffected by spell or trap effects and by activated effects from any monster whose original level or rank is lower than this card's current level. Now, the fact that you could set this card on the field when you summon it, and it's the effect that it wouldn't be affected by pretty much anything, was just broken as shit. Add into that pretty much all the powerhouse monsters at the time were actually lower than level 10, with the exception of Leo, Keeper of the Sacred Tree. I mean, that was just ridiculous. But then it goes even further. All special summon monsters lose 500 attack and defense. Well, okay, if you could get Leo on the field, well, there goes your Leo's advantage over it. Furthermore, it says once per turn, you can make your opponent send one monster from their hand or their side of the field to the graveyard, your opponent's choice. Well, okay, protection, easy summoning requirements, unaffected by pretty much everything, and it could send your opponent's monsters to the graveyard without destroying them. Yeah, salty as shit. So, this card definitely deserved a spot on the list, and yeah, it might have probably deserved a higher spot, but there are actually, in my opinions, cards that were better than this. Coming in at number 4 is the trap card Skill Drain. Now, I know a lot of you are saying, after Cleafort Towers, what could really be more powerful, or more salty, I should say? Well, Skill Drain is actually one of the few that is more salty. Given the fact that it can be splashed in almost every deck, it allows you to make all your major plays, get all your big stuff out on the field, and then negate all your opponent's monsters' effects. I mean, that's just salty as shit right there. And while it may not cause people to be super salty these days because we have Twin Twisters, Galaxy Cyclone, MST, pretty much all the spell and trap destruction and back row hate, in its heyday, this is a card that really just shut your opponent down from pretty much doing everything, has earned a nice little title on the limited list because of it. Now, the cost of paying 1,000 life points really isn't a big deal these days either because of all the OTK potentials for decks. So this, in my opinion, definitely need to be ranked higher than Cleafort Tower. The number 1 go-to card for Boojins is Kaiser Coliseum. This card ranks 3 on the list merely because in its heyday during the formats when Boojins were really running things, this card was just nearly impossible to get around. With it being unlimited at the time that Boojins were really in their heyday, it was really hard to get around this. Even if you managed to destroy one copy, your opponent usually had another copy waiting for you. Now, this card does is that the turn player has at least one monster on the field, or the controller of this card has one monster on the field. Their opponent cannot place a monster on the field if the number of monsters would exceed the number of monsters that are on the field of this card's controller. And the only downside is that if your opponent already had more monsters than you on the field when you activate this, they weren't the current monsters on the field weren't affected. So ideally, what you would have wanted to do with this card, like with Boojins, put one monster on the field, activate this, and then your opponent was pretty much screwed because the one monster your opponent could get on the field usually couldn't get around the fact that you had an Honest in your hand or a Turtle in your graveyard, etc., etc. Need I go on? Holding the number 2 spot is Evil Swarm Exciton Knight. This card actually rewarded players for overextending themselves and using up all their resources. Now, the effect of this card states that once per chain during your main phase or your opponent's battle phase, if your opponent has more total cards in their hand and their side of the field than you do, you can attach one material from this card, destroy all other cards on the field. Also, your opponent takes no further damage this turn, and this is a quick effect. Now, if you really love overextending yourself and you had the ability to make a rank 4 monster, this is usually your go-to card. Mainly because as soon as you got it past your opponent's battle phase, this card was wiping out everything your opponent had just done to get shit on the field. In addition to that, you could just, drop this card on the field real easy if your opponent managed to get rid of all your stuff and then blow up all your opponent's stuff. This card is just real salty because 9 times out of 10, if your opponent played this, then all you could do is just really scoop. And there was a lot of people that just scooped as soon as this card was played on the field because they just felt it was unfair that people were rewarded for playing badly. The number 1 spot is tied between 2 cards, the first of which being Judgement Draggin. Now, this card could only be special summoned by having 4 more Life Swarms with different names in your graveyard, and multiple times per turn, as many times as you wanted. Each turn, you pay 1,000 life points to destroy all other cards on the field, and during each of your end phases, you milled 4 cards. Now, the fact that you could only special summon it by having 4 more Life Swarms with different names in your graveyard was not that difficult, considering Life Swarms revolve around milling themselves. Now, furthermore, the effect to destroy everything on the field but itself, being able to use that effect multiple times in the same turn just made sure that your opponent never had cards on the field as long as you had the life points to pay. Now, in addition to that, this card having 3,000 attack points and 2,600 defense points, its stats were really incredible, and it's just really hard to get around this card. Also tied for the number 1 spot is Chaos Emperor Dragon, Envoy of the End. Now, the reason Judgement Draggin and Emperor Dragon are tied is because their effects are pretty similar, and they made people just as salty. Now, Chaos Emperor Dragon's effect states that it cannot be normal summoned or set, and must first be special summoned from your hand by banishing 1 light and 1 dark monster from your graveyard, conditions that were really easy to make. And you can pay 1,000 life points to send all other cards in both players' hands and on the field to the graveyard, then inflict 300 damage to your opponent for each card sent to the graveyard by this effect. Now, given the fact that this got rid of cards not only from the field but from the hands as well, made this card extremely potent, and then it was hitting your opponent for 300 damage for each card sent, was just really ridiculous. Now, the reason it was tied for Judgement Draggin is because whereas Judgement Draggin can keep itself on the field and attack, Chaos Emperor Dragon just deals effect damage and sends cards to the graveyard without destroying them. So there are some differences in these cards, but they're just so similar, and they pretty much do the exact same thing, put your opponent in the exact same situation pretty much. But that's why they were tied for the same spot. I just couldn't really decide which one was more salty. So in the comment section below, let me know what you thought about this video. As always, make sure you like the video, subscribe to my channel, and until next time, this is Harpy Hunter 89 signing off.